3 women, 1 house, 10 years, and an entire neighborhood had no idea. This is not a story about monsters that hide in the dark. This is a story about a monster who mowed his lawn, waved at his neighbors, and drove a school bus full of children every single day. And behind the walls of his ordinary-looking house on Seymour Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio, 3 young women were living in a hell that most people cannot begin to imagine. This is the story of Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight, 3 names that the world would not hear together until May 6, 2013, the day everything changed. The day one brave woman decided she had nothing left to lose. But before we get to that moment, we need to go back to a city that was losing its daughters, one by one, and barely even noticed. Back to the streets where these women walked before the world swallowed them whole. Back to the beginning of a nightmare that lasted longer than most people can even imagine surviving. Cleveland, Ohio, a working-class city with proud roots and hard streets, a city of real people trying to live real lives, parents going to work, kids going to school, neighbors knowing neighbors. It was the kind of place where people minded their business and trusted that the world was mostly safe. That trust would be shattered, and the shattering would happen slowly, quietly, on a single street in a neighborhood that looked completely normal from the outside. It was the kind of neighborhood where you left your door unlocked sometimes, where kids walked to school alone, where people waved from their porches. The kind of place where evil was supposed to look like a stranger, not like your neighbor. Seymour Avenue was not glamorous. It was not wealthy, but it was a community. People lived there, raised families there, grew old there, and one of those people was a man named Ariel Castro, a stocky, ordinary-looking man in his 40s. He had 3 adult children of his own. He played bass in a local band. He coached a youth baseball team. His neighbors knew his face. His co-workers knew his name. For over 2 decades, he drove a school bus for the Cleveland Metropolitan School District. Every morning he picked up children. Every afternoon he dropped them home. He smiled. He talked. He seemed completely, utterly, dangerously normal. People trusted him with their children. They waved when he walked by. They shared meals at neighborhood gatherings. They had no idea. They had absolutely no idea what was happening behind the doors of the house at 2207 Seymour Avenue. But normal was the mask. And behind that mask lived something that cannot be described with a single word. What Ariel Castro truly was would only become fully clear years later, inside a courtroom, in statements that left the entire world speechless. The distance between who he appeared to be and who he actually was is one of the most disturbing parts of this entire story, because it forces every single one of us to ask a question we do not want to ask. How well do we really know the people around us? It began with Michelle Knight. She was 21 years old in 2002. Her life had not been easy. She had grown up facing hardships that would break most people. She had already experienced loss and instability before the worst thing imaginable happened to her. By the time she crossed paths with Ariel Castro, she was already navigating a world that had not been kind to her. She met Castro through a connection to his family. He offered her a ride. She said she needed help finding an address. He said he could help. She accepted. She got into his vehicle. She was never seen again. Not for 11 years. The people who should have looked hardest for Michelle were slow to act. Her case was not treated with urgency. She was an adult. She had a complicated personal history. In the cold and brutal math of how much attention missing persons cases receive, her disappearance barely registered. That invisibility would haunt her story for years to come. A woman had vanished, and the world barely blinked. Then came Amanda Berry. She was 16 years old, April 21st, 2003. The night before her 17th birthday, she had been working a shift at a Burger King near her home. She called her sister that evening and said she had gotten a ride home from a coworker. She said she would be there soon. She sounded fine. She sounded normal. She never arrived. Her mother, Luana Miller, refused to accept that her daughter was simply gone. She went on television. She sat across from talk show hosts and begged for information. She made flyers. She searched streets. She called investigators. She prayed every night. Luana Miller was the kind of mother who would tear the world apart to find her child. She spent years fighting for Amanda, convinced deep in her bones that her daughter was still alive, still somewhere in this world, waiting to be found. But the years passed, and the answers never came. Luana Miller died in March 2006, without ever knowing the truth. without ever seeing her daughter's face again outside of photographs. She died believing her daughter was still out there. She was right, but she never got to know it. The grief of that, the specific tragedy of a mother dying without her answer, is almost too painful to hold. And then, just 1 year after Amanda vanished, the nightmare reached again. April 2nd, 2004. 14-year-old Gina DeJesus disappeared just blocks from her home. She had been talking to a friend on a payphone outside a convenience store after school. She turned and started walking home. She never made it. Gina was 14 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. She had a family who loved her fiercely and who would spend the next decade refusing to stop looking. Her parents, Felix and Nancy DeJesus, never accepted that their daughter was gone. They put up flyers on every corner. They organized searches through the neighborhood. They kept her name alive in the community and in the press, refusing to let Gina become just another cold case. Felix DeJesus was, in a dark and devastating irony that is almost impossible to comprehend, close friends with Ariel Castro. They had known each other for years. The man who stole his daughter had stood beside him at community events, had looked him in the eye, had perhaps even joined in conversations about finding the missing girls. The cruelty of that detail is almost incomprehensible. It is the kind of detail that makes your stomach drop when you truly sit with it. 3 women, 3 disappearances, each one swallowed by the silence of a city that was slowly moving on without them. Inside the house on Seymour Avenue, the nightmare was real, and it was daily. The 3 women were kept in separate rooms, often chained, often locked behind heavy reinforced doors, designed specifically to prevent escape. The windows were boarded shut. Layers of locks and barriers separated them from the outside world. There was no natural light that came with freedom attached to it. There was no morning that did not begin with the crushing weight of captivity. Ariel Castro controlled everything with terrifying precision. He controlled when they ate and how much. He controlled when they slept. He decided whether they were allowed any human contact with each other at all. He used psychological manipulation as deliberately as physical restraint, telling each woman that the others did not want to be around her, creating artificial divisions to deepen the isolation. He wanted them broken down completely. He worked at it every single day. He was patient about it. He was methodical, and for a long time, it seemed to be working. But something he did not count on was the kind of strength that exists inside a person who has already survived loss before captivity ever began. Michelle Knight had known hardship long before that car ride in 2002. She had already learned to survive in circumstances that would defeat most people. That experience did not make captivity bearable. Nothing could make it bearable, but it gave her something inside, some unbreakable core that Castro could not reach no matter how hard he tried. She endured things inside those walls that are deeply painful to describe. She suffered in ways that go beyond what most human beings are ever tested with. She was targeted with specific cruelty beyond standard captivity. She lost things inside that house that can never be returned to her. And yet, through all of it, something in her refused to disappear. She adapted. She found ways to exist that preserved something essential, something human, something that was entirely her own. Amanda Berry became a mother inside that house. In late 2006, she gave birth to a daughter, a little girl who arrived in a world that she had no ability to understand yet. A little girl born into captivity who would spend the first years of her life knowing only the inside of that house. Amanda named her Jocelyn, and from the very first moment that child took a breath in the world, something inside Amanda shifted permanently. She was no longer just a survivor fighting for herself. She was a mother, and that changes everything. Every morning he woke up to her daughter's face was a morning that demanded she keep going. That maternal love, fierce and protective and completely unstoppable, would one day be the exact force that pushed Amanda past the edge of fear and toward the door. Gina DeJesus was the youngest when she was taken. She was 14 years old, still becoming who she was going to be, when Castro took that future away from her. She grew into a young woman inside those walls, in captivity, in darkness, without the normal milestones of adolescence that every young person deserves. And yet, her spirit remained something that the situation could not fully extinguish. She and Amanda formed a bond, a genuine and deep friendship built in the most impossible of places. In the rare moments that Castro allowed them to be near each other, They found ways to hold each other up. They whispered hope to each other when hope had no logical basis to exist. They shared small acts of kindness that cost nothing but meant everything. In a world specifically designed to make survival feel pointless, they manufactured reasons to survive from absolutely nothing. The years passed with a heaviness that is hard to describe to someone who has not experienced true captivity. Outside on Seymour Avenue, life continued as it always does. Seasons changed, neighbors came and went, children grew up and moved away, new families arrived, music played, barbecues happened, and inside number 2207, 3 women waited, not passively, not without hope, but they waited for a moment that they had no guarantee would ever come. Amanda would later describe praying every single day of those 10 years, not just hoping, actively, desperately, daily praying, believing in rescue, even when the physical reality around her offered zero evidence that rescue was coming, even when another birthday passed inside those walls, even when another year turned over without a knock on the door. There were moments, scattered across those 10 years, when the outside world came terrifyingly close to uncovering the truth. Police responded to calls at or near the house on more than one occasion. Neighbors reported strange things at various points. A woman seen in the backyard, unusual sounds, something that felt slightly wrong but could not be precisely named. One neighbor reported seeing a naked woman crawling in the backyard. The call was made. The response was inadequate. Castro was careful. He was experienced. He had been maintaining this secret for years, and he had learned how to manage every variable with frightening precision. He knew how to make the house look ordinary. He knew which behaviors to perform in public. He knew how long he could leave, and how to ensure they could not escape in his absence. He had built a system, and that system held for a decade. Inside, time did not move the way it does for people who are free. There were no milestones that felt like milestones. Birthdays that passed uncelebrated. Holidays that came and went like ordinary days except heavier. The passage of time was something you either measured in suffering or you learned to stop measuring at all. You survived the hour you were in, then the next hour, then the next day. That was the only math that made sense. But Amanda Berry had Jocelyn, and watching her daughter grow, watching this little girl who had never seen a park or a school or a grocery store develop a personality and a curiosity and a hunger for a world she had never touched, did something to Amanda that Castro could not control or predict. It made her more determined, not more resigned. Every year that passed was another year of Jocelyn's childhood being stolen, and Amanda Berry had decided somewhere in the depths of those dark rooms that she was not going to allow that to continue forever. She began watching, waiting for gaps, testing limits carefully, secretly. Over time, May 6, 2013, a Monday afternoon, Ariel Castro had left the house. The particular stillness of his absence settled over the rooms. Amanda Berry had been working at a door. Over time, quietly, she had learned that one of the interior doors had a weakness, that if enough force was applied to a specific point, it could be moved. She had found a gap between the outer door and its frame, not large, but possibly large enough. On this particular afternoon, with her 6-year-old daughter standing beside her, Amanda Berry made the decision. She started screaming. Through the gap in the outer door, into the open air of Seymour Avenue, she screamed with everything she had. A neighbor named Charles Ramsey heard her. He had been at home eating when the screaming reached him. He came outside. He saw a woman trying to get out through a door that would not open all the way. He helped force the door open. Amanda Berry stepped out onto the sidewalk of Seymour Avenue for the first time in 10 years. She was shaking. She was barefoot. She was 27 years old, and she had gone in as a 16-year-old girl. She asked Charles Ramsey to call 911. He handed her his phone. The 911 call is one of the most emotionally overwhelming recordings associated with this case. Amanda Berry's voice shakes, but it is certain. There is no confusion in it. She tells the operator her name. She says she has been kidnapped for 10 years. She gives the address clearly. The operator, in a moment that was later heavily criticized, responds with a tone that suggests skepticism and asks her to stay on the line and wait for officers. Amanda stays on the line. She stands outside. She breathes air that is not filtered through boarded windows. She stands on a sidewalk she last walked as a teenager, clutching a borrowed phone, waiting for sirens. Neighbors begin to come out. People gather. And then the police arrive. Officers enter the house immediately. They found Gina DeJesus and Michelle Knight inside. The women who emerged from that house carried 10 years in their bodies. They were older. They were thinner. They carried in their eyes something that only people who have survived that kind of darkness ever carry. But they were alive. After everything. After a decade. They were alive. They walked out of 2207 Seymour Avenue in the afternoon light of a May Monday, and the world would never be the same. The moment Michelle Knight came outside and found Amanda, she threw her arms around her and held on for a long time. She did not let go quickly. It was the kind of embrace that holds 10 years of shared darkness and 10 years of shared survival, and the enormous, almost unbearable relief of finally being outside together. Words cannot carry what that moment contained. The hug said everything. News broke across Cleveland within hours, and then exploded across the country. The details were almost impossible for the public to process. 3 women, missing for years, found alive in a house that had been sitting in a residential neighborhood the entire time. A man who had been a visible, functioning member of that community for decades. Neighbors who were devastated and horrified by what had been happening feet from their own homes. The disbelief was immediate and total. The grief followed, then the anger. Ariel Castro was arrested that same evening without resistance. What investigators found inside that house was extensive and deeply disturbing. The evidence told a story of systematic, prolonged, calculated abuse. He was charged with over 500 counts including kidnapping, rape, and aggravated murder for acts that had caused the loss of pregnancies. The case against him was overwhelming. In August 2013, Ariel Castro stood in a courtroom and delivered a statement that stunned the nation. He minimized everything. He constructed a version of events that bore no resemblance to reality, as his victims had lived it. He spoke about harmony in the house. He blamed addiction. He blamed others. He presented himself as something other than what the evidence so clearly showed he was. The courtroom sat in a silence that was thick with controlled disbelief and rage. And then Michelle Knight stood up. The woman who had been overlooked the longest. The woman whose disappearance had received the least attention. The woman who had survived 11 years in those walls and carried the deepest wounds of any of the 3 survivors. She stood up, faced Ariel Castro directly, and spoke. Her voice was steady. It did not shake. She looked at him, and she told him exactly what she needed him to hear. She told him that she had overcome what he did, that she had chosen to move forward, that she refused to be defined by what happened inside that house, that the little girl he had tried to destroy had survived and had become something he could never take away. It was one of the most powerful victim impact statements ever delivered in an American courtroom. The room was silent, and then it was not. Ariel Castro was sentenced to life in prison plus 1,000 years, with no possibility of parole. He never came close to serving that sentence. On September 3, 2013, less than a month after sentencing, he was found dead in his prison cell. He had taken his own life. The response from survivors was measured. Justice in the traditional sense had been removed from the equation before it could fully unfold. But he was gone, and they remained. Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight have each continued their lives in the years since that May afternoon. Amanda and Gina eventually went public together, co-authoring a book about their experiences and speaking carefully about healing and the long work of recovery. Michelle Knight chose a different path. She changed her name to Lily Rose Lee and became a public advocate for survivors of abuse and trauma. She wrote a book. She speaks to audiences. She runs programs for people in similar situations. What Castro spent years trying to silence became the loudest and most enduring thing about her. The house on Seymour Avenue was demolished. The empty lot was transformed into a memorial garden where the community could grieve and reflect. The address that held so much suffering was replaced with something open and quiet, and dedicated to the possibility of healing. But the questions that this case raises have not gone away. They never go away after something like this. How does a man abduct 3 women over the course of 2 years and maintain that secret for a decade in a residential neighborhood? How did Michelle Knight's disappearance fail to generate the urgent response it deserved? What does it reveal about who our systems choose to search for and who they quietly decide to forget? How many warning signs were missed, reported, and not followed up on? How many moments existed where a different decision by a different person could have changed everything years earlier. These questions are uncomfortable. They implicate systems and communities and human failures of attention and empathy. But they are the questions we have to ask if we want stories like this one to mean something beyond the horror of the events themselves. Amanda Berry screamed through a crack in a door because she refused to believe that the world had forgotten her. She was right to refuse. She was always right to refuse. But she should never have had to wait 10 years for someone to hear her. What does this case say to you about how we protect people, how we look for them when they vanish, and how evil can exist in plain sight when we choose not to look too closely? Leave your thoughts below, because the only way stories like this one matter is if they change something in how we see the world around us and the people standing right next to us every single day.